This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 186 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Since we're getting closer and closer to the fantasy football playoffs, I'll be trying to focus a few transactions each week on players to target for that specific part of the fantasy football season. I know a lot of you are sitting pretty right now, so it's important and smart to plan ahead for weeks 14 through 16, or hopefully weeks 15 and 16 since you'll have a bye. Before we look at this week's transactions though, I wanted to remind you guys to check out NumberFire Premium. With award-winning DFS tools, advanced stats, and expert content, Premium has everything you need to dominate across all three sports. If you're a new user, try it out and get your first month for only $7.95 with promo code CLUTCH. That's promo code CLUTCH. Visit numberfire.com/premium for more details. Buy Juju Smith-Schuster. So Juju got off to a hot start in 2018, but he's cooled off a bit. He's failed to reach 35 receiving yards in 2 of his last 4 games, and he's scored just once since week 2. But everything outside of that has looked really, really good for Juju. He has a strong 22.6% target share in that Steelers offense, and he's second in the NFL in red zone targets. Only Alvin Kamara has more red zone targets than Juju Smith-Schuster this year. And that's a big reason to expect positive touchdown regression. Juju scored just twice while tallying 672 receiving yards. He's found the end zone on every 336 yards. Over the last 7 years, wide receivers have scored on every 167 yards receiving. So he's underperforming in the touchdown column. And considering that he's seeing a lot of red zone looks, that screams positive regression. And then there's the playoff schedule. The Steelers' passing attack has a real chance to go nuts in weeks 14 through 16 because they're facing Oakland, New England, and New Orleans. The Raiders and Saints have allowed the 2 highest net yards per attempt rates this season, while New England ranks 16th. And that New England game is being played in Pittsburgh. Sell Jordan Howard. Howard's now scored 4 touchdowns across his last 3 games played. And during this time, he's out-attempted Tariq Cohen 48-17. So those are your 2 selling points. He's seeing volume on the ground, and he's scoring touchdowns. But the truth is, things could not be going better for Jordan Howard. The Bears played the Jets and the Bills over the last 2 weeks, leading to strong positive game scripts. The game scripts were so good that Chicago didn't even run a play while trailing in those games. And then 3 weeks ago against New England, Howard ran the ball for just 39 yards. He just happened to find the end zone. Jordan Howard has just 1 target since week 6. And we know that targets are far more valuable than carries in fantasy football. Now, the team's schedule isn't that bad from here on out, but his touchdown and game script dependency makes him a really volatile fantasy football asset. And that's generally not the type of player that I want on my fantasy team. Hold Tevin Coleman. You know, in most cases, I'd be all over selling a split backfield runner who's coming off a multi-touchdown game. But in Tevin Coleman's case, clearly, I like him more as a hold. The Falcons running backs haven't been very good this year. Even after Week 9's performance, they ranked 25th in team running back rushing yards, and they're 20th in running back receptions and receiving yards. Last year, just for some context, they were 10th in rushing yardage while maintaining a similar rank through the air. But Coleman's receiving usage on Sunday really should excite fantasy managers. He saw 7 targets when his previous single game high this year was just 4. So forget the fact that he scored twice on those targets. An 18.4% target share is unbelievable for a running back in that offense. Now, we shouldn't expect that type of workload to continue, but it's smart to wait and see if Atlanta continues to get their backs more involved in the passing game. And they get the Browns this week, so even if they don't utilize Coleman the same way as a receiver, it might not matter, because Cleveland's allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing backs. In other words, Coleman should still hold his current value through week 10. You can wait and see. And if they do throw it his way more often, then we're looking at more of a trend, and that's great news if you have Tevin Coleman. Add Kiki Cutie. A large part of me wants to sell the entire Houston Texans passing attack. Aside from DeAndre Hopkins, of course. Because Deshaun Watson keeps having these low volume, low yardage outings. Over the team's first 5 games, Watson averaged 38.4 attempts and 324.2 passing yards per game. But across Houston's last 4 games, that attempt number has dropped to just 23.3, while Watson's yards per game has fallen to 192. That's a significant difference. Maybe some of that has to do with Watson's chest injury, but competition is definitely playing a role here. The Texans are on a 6-game winning streak, and over their last 4 games, they've faced Buffalo, Jacksonville, Miami, and Denver. They've seen struggling teams or at least below average offenses. And when that's the case, a quarterback and his receivers have to rely on efficiency instead of volume. The good news is that they have their bye this week, so Watson can rest up. And out of their bye, they really don't have a scary matchup until after the fantasy football season. And in the fantasy playoffs, in weeks 14 through 16, they'll face Indianapolis, New York, that's the Jets, and Philadelphia. Those are all plus matchups from a fantasy perspective. So that's why Kiki Cutie is an ad once again this week. He's still available on 73% of Yahoo waiver wires, and he will have his slot role in the offense when he's back and healthy. I mean, keep in mind, in Cutie's 4 games played this year, he's had a 22.2% target share. Considering the team's bye this week, he shouldn't be hard to snag off the wire if he's still out there. Buy Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen had arguably his best game of the season on Sunday. He caught 6 of his 10 targets for 124 yards. But again, he didn't find the end zone. He still hasn't scored since week 1. That's really the main reason you're buying Keenan Allen this week, though. That, as well as the fact that the Chargers are playing the Raiders, and the Raiders are a complete dumpster fire defensively. But Allen has just 1 score on 630 yards receiving. His yardage total, based on wide receiver data going back to 2011, tells us that he should have closer to 3 or 4 touchdowns. At that normal rate, Allen would be averaging 2 more points per game, which would make him easily a top 15 wide receiver in PPR formats. So if the manager who's got Keenan Allen is down on him for his lack of touchdowns, it's not a bad idea to try to buy him based on positive touchdown regression alone. Add Elijah McGuire. In Elijah McGuire's first game action this season, he carried the ball 6 times versus teammate Isaiah Crowell's 13, but he was able to out-target him 5-2. McGuire was actually on the field for 13 more snaps than Isaiah Crowell against the Dolphins. Now, that probably had a lot to do with the Jets facing a negative game script, but the Jets are going to face a lot of negative game scripts. They're not very good. Now, they do face Buffalo in 2 of their next 4 games, which could mean more Isaiah Crowell, but with this being McGuire's first game action of the season, there's always a chance that the Jets want to feature him more than they did on Sunday as well. So I do think that he continues to be an interesting flyer off the waiver wire. Drop Matthew Stafford. Stafford's been okay enough from a fantasy perspective this year, but he certainly has lacked upside. He's actually finished as a top 12 QB1 just once this season. In a lot of leagues, there are probably options who are equal to Stafford on your waiver wire, especially if you consider Detroit's schedule from here on out. They still have to face the Bears twice, and in the fantasy playoffs, they'll be on the road against Arizona and Buffalo before hosting Minnesota. Each of those teams are top 11 in fantasy points allowed to the quarterback position. It's just not attractive enough to hold on to Stafford, especially without Golden Tate. Now, given how your league looks at the quarterback position, maybe you can't drop Matthew Stafford. But in a lot of leagues, I know that you can. He just doesn't have that high of a ceiling from here on out. Hold Duke Johnson. So with Hugh Jackson and Todd Haley with the Browns this year, Duke Johnson, who by the way has led running backs in receptions from 2015 through 2017, he averaged 3.6 targets per game with those 2 guys there. Without Jackson and Haley in week 9, Duke Johnson saw 9 targets. It went from 3.6 per game to 9. Maybe this was just a matchup thing, because Kansas City entered the week ranked 2nd in receptions allowed to running backs, and according to NumberFire's expected points model, the Chiefs also allowed a top 10 success rate to the running back position through the air. And it's not like we saw an abnormally high snap rate from Duke Johnson. He had a 46.7% rate this past weekend when he's hit that in 3 other games this year. And while his routes run number was one of the higher marks at the running back position in week 9, the 26 routes run, according to Pro Football Focus, was actually on par with what we'd seen from him in weeks 5, 6, and 7. Now, I love me some Duke Johnson. I think Duke Johnson's a really good running back. But I'm just trying to be level-headed here. Because really, there may be just as much of a chance that he's not back than he is back. But you don't need to bet on that this week. Because in week 10, Cleveland just happens to be facing Atlanta, who have easily given up the most running back receptions over the last few seasons in the NFL. So you might want to just hold on to Duke Johnson for 1 more week, get his value even higher, and then just reevaluate. Add Mike Davis. Chris Carson is banged up with a hip injury, and he only played 10 snaps on Sunday as a result. And in his place was Mike Davis. Mike Davis was on the field for 72.8% of Seattle's snaps, and he ended the game with 15 of a possible 27 running back carries for Seattle, and he was heavily involved in the passing game. He caught 7 of 8 targets. So if Chris Carson misses time, then Davis instantly becomes fantasy relevant. And seeing work in the short term could be pretty big for Mike Davis, especially as a receiving back, because the Seahawks are facing the Rams and the Packers over their next 2 games. There could be a lot of passing. Buy Devin Funchess. So Funchess has sort of had a rough time over the past 2 weeks. He has just 7 catches for 71 yards. Now, one of his matchups was tough against Baltimore, but we all expected a lot more from him this past week against Tampa Bay. Instead, we got 5 targets and 4 catches. So clearly, because of how he's performed over the last 2 weeks, this is a buy low moment. And really, the main reason that you should be buying him isn't so much that his target share has been out of control. It's not like he's been this dominant wide receiver that you absolutely need to roster. It's that Carolina has an unreal fantasy playoff schedule. In week 14, they're going to get the Browns. The Browns have allowed the 10th most points per game to opposing wide receivers this year. And then they're going to get the Saints, who have given up the most. And then in week 16, you're looking at the Falcons, who rank 3rd worst against opposing wide receivers. So sure, Funchess pooped the bed in a great matchup this week. But that playoff schedule is really tough to ignore. I think that you really could consider most Carolina players as buys right now. Add Theo Riddick. Riddick ran 30 routes in week 9 according to PFF, tying Kerryon Johnson's week 8 mark for a Detroit season high at the running back position. The Lions also put Riddick in the slot for 5 of his snaps, and he was targeted there once. Now, we know there's a void in the Lions' passing attack with Golden Tate no longer there. And even though Riddick didn't simply take on the slot role in week 9, there's enough potential for him as a pass catcher to be added off the waiver wire this week. And if you can accurately predict the Lions being in a negative game script, then you'll be able to get some production from Theo Riddick in PPR formats. Add Marquez Valdez-Scantling. This is another repeat transaction from last week, but you gotta add MVS. He's second among Green Bay wide receivers in routes run over the last 2 weeks. He's played more snaps than Randall Cobb in both week 8 and week 9, and he's hit almost 150 yards receiving. So with Geronimo Allison sidelined, MVS could play a decent-sized role in the coming weeks. Get him off the waiver wire. Buy Courtland Sutton. In Sutton's debut as the Broncos' number 2 receiver on Sunday, he saw 5 of 42 Case Keenum attempts. That's an 11.9% target share. That's actually lower than what Sutton was seeing with Demaryius Thomas in that lineup. But the good news is Sutton clearly ran as the team's number 2 wide receiver. And in the spirit of looking ahead, Denver has a really nice fantasy football playoff schedule. Week 14 features a game against San Francisco, and then Denver will face Cleveland in week 15 and Oakland in week 16. Those are all plus matchups for a fantasy football wide receiver. So with Courtland Sutton's down game, this is probably now the time to act. Add Blake Bortles. There are tons of quarterbacks who are rostered in that 30% to 70% range over on Yahoo, and that puts them outside the typical streaming range at the quarterback position. But if someone like Baker Mayfield or Ryan Fitzpatrick are available, given their week 10 matchups, they're probably better options than this week's more traditional streamer, Blake Bortles. Bortles has been pretty bad this year, but he's actually had some fine performances in fantasy football. Half of his games have been usable. And he'll face a Colts defense this week that surrendered a top 15 quarterback outing in 4 of their last 5 games. The one quarterback who didn't finish in the top 15 was Derek Anderson. And their competition hasn't been very strong. They've faced Sam Darnold and Derek Carr. So this game has a decent enough 47-point over-under, and the Jags are 3-point underdogs. I think that you could do worse than Blake Bortles this week. Add the New York Jets defense. New York is rostered in 37% of Yahoo leagues, which makes them kind of a fringe streamer this week. But you guys would be hitting my Twitter mentions if I didn't talk about them on today's podcast. And it's because they're facing the Bills. And the Bills' offense is absolutely horrendous. Fantasy defenses against Buffalo have finished in the top 6 in weekly scoring in 7 of 9 games played this year. Now get this, defenses are averaging, these are averages, 3.7 sacks, 6.4 quarterback hits, and 1.8 interceptions against them per game. That alone gives you a floor of nearly 8 fantasy points from your defense. The Jets are easily a top option this week. As always, I've got a 16th transaction on the show that you can't get in my weekly 15 transactions column. And to be honest, it was tough to nail down just one this week. So I'm going to give you guys 3 additional waiver wire options. One is Jeff Hireman. He's actually someone that I talked about last week in my weekly column, The Report. He had 11 targets and he caught 10 of them on Sunday. That's a pretty good sign in this post-Demaryius Thomas world. And then there's Cordarrelle Patterson, who's really just an ad if Sony Michel keeps missing time. He had double-digit rushes for a second straight game, and he also saw some goal line work. So I think Cordarrelle Patterson is worth an ad. And then John Ross is another one. AJ Green is probably going to miss some time with a foot injury, so someone in that offense is going to have to step up. Now, Ross isn't the prototypical number one wideout, but he returned to practice on Monday, which is a good sign, and we know that there is some talent there, especially big play talent. Do your best to read up on who may step in for AJ Green, though. It may be more of a committee type situation with Tyler Boyd being the only consistent piece. But Ross, to me, probably has the most upside of anyone who would step in. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to everyone for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, and Stitcher. I'm also on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.